Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us for this Diverse Tech Live event. This is day 2 of our exciting 2-day event in diversity and inclusion in the technology industry. If you have joined us, having joined us yesterday, thanks very much for coming back. If you are joining for the first time today, we will be sending you an email later on with all the links to listen to yesterday's sessions back if you would like to watch those on demand. Today, our first presentation will be given by Pagels-Minor, who I will introduce in a second. And during the webinar, if you have any questions for us, any technical issues or any questions you'd like to put to B, then please just enter those in the chat box that you should see on your screen, and we will put those questions to B as we go along. So any technical issues, just pop those in that chat box as well, and we will get onto them straight away. So it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce B. Pagels-Minor, who is Senior Data Project Manager at Netflix. So just a little bit about B. B is a native of Mississippi who relocated to Silicon Valley in 2018 from Chicago. B has worked with a variety of small and large tech companies to increase product adoption, improve the product experience and design, and evolve the product vision. B is a thought leader on product and culture development within tech companies, and they're passionate about creating a culture of accountability and sustainable processes that allow teams to just do the work well, which is obviously a great sentiment I'm sure we will all agree with. So welcome, B. Thanks so much for joining us at what is an incredibly early time over there for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, when you said good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I was like,
Which
still don't
one?
know if it's evening or we're just gonna go with it.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate you joining us at this bizarre time anyway, so thank you so much. So just to kick things off, B, would you like to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, what your personal experience has been working in tech, and what being included means to you?
Yeah, so I'm B. Pagels-Minor. My pronouns are they, them, their. I identify as a trans non-binary lesbian. A few random facts about myself. First and foremost, I'm married to my amazing wife, Alyssa. We've been married for 4 years. I am originally from like the Mississippi, Tennessee area, so I'm a true Southerner. In fact, especially because I'm a little tired, there's going to be a lot of y'alls that are probably going to come out of this
Absolutely fine.
conversation. And that's definitely one of the things that I take with me. I always tell folks that I lead with that Southern mentality, which is like when I walk into a room, everyone has the potential to be a friend. And then I've worked in tech for let's see, about 10 years. So I started off actually in very low level tech, like just customer service, tech support, and then kind of landed myself at a great startup that allowed me to kind of grow my wings and become a product manager. And what's really great about that is that because I started off with a startup that had less than 25 people, I've had that experience of what it means to actually just even understand what it means to build a company, right? When you're first trying to think, should we get a 401k? What is a 401k? Like, how much does it actually cost? How do you choose which insurance company? And then, I've worked at, now I currently work at Netflix, but I worked at Apple and some other really, really large tech companies as well. So I've had kind of like that gigantic experience. And so then one of the questions you asked was like, what does inclusion mean? And it's really interesting because obviously there's a lot of talk about like this larger concept of DEI, right, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what's really interesting is that I actually find that I define inclusion with equity, right? And the reason for that is because to me, to be included from a very simplistic standpoint might be, I am allowed to have a job or I'm allowed to go into a space that maybe has people who don't look like me or love like me or, have the same sexual orient, or have the same gender representation as me. But if I don't have equity, if I don't have the power to have my voice be heard and felt in the same exact way as someone who is a part of the larger crowd, am I really being included? Right. And so there is like that compounded effect, in my opinion. If you really want to be an inclusive space, you have to treat those people, all people, equally, that have their voices be heard equally, have them get paid equally, so that it's a level ground, level field for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And what have you found to be the main differences when it comes to DEI across the larger companies and the smaller companies? We often hear that it sometimes is easier to make a change when you are starting out and you're smaller, whereas for some of the giants you've worked for, so your Apple, for example, and Netflix now, do you think it's kind of harder for a change to be made? Are there different strategies that need to be used? What's your experience of having worked in such different environments?
Yeah, I find that it definitely varies, right? One of the things that I always keep in mind is that it really depends on the leadership. And the reason I say that is I think Slack is a great example. So for the first, I don't know, something like, you know, majority of the existence of this company, they never had DEI teams. It was just something that the leadership team said, we would like to be the best in class with DEI principles. And so then the CEO, that was their, like, that was his core value. And he kind of just imbued that throughout the organization. So they didn't necessarily have the same types of issues that some tech companies have when it comes to just all like a broad umbrella of DEI issues. So I do think that that's like the huge caveat to this. So I don't think there really is smaller companies are easier, larger companies are easier. It's about the bravery of leadership and the courage of leadership to say, like, this is exactly what we think our values are, and then ensuring that everyone in the organization follows those different values. I feel the same way at Netflix. There's a doc that anyone can Google, which is like the Netflix culture doc, and it talks about these key concepts of radical candor or great judgment, no brilliant jerks, right? And so then when I go into a room, especially as a diverse person, I have a whole armor of like tools that this values doc allows me to say, oh, that's not okay. Which to be truthful, I haven't had to do that. But the thing is, if I had to do it, like everyone knows from a cultural norm that I have the power to say what the space should look like, acceptable behavior. Now, on the flip side of that, some things that are difficult, right? So when I worked at some smaller organizations, especially the ones that aren't quite like struggling, right? Like companies that have like a decent amount of funding, have like they've understand their product market fit and they have customers. I've actually had more issues at those organizations. And so I wouldn't even call them medium. I would call them
Mm,
medium. So they're like small to medium sized companies where they've had enough success that sometimes they kind of create these artifacts of culture, right? So for instance, I worked at one company that was a very like, kind of playboy, like people like to party together and things like that. And so what happened is that they had memorialized the fact that it was okay to have that attitude in the office space. So the same exact attitude they had when they would go out drinking, they would bring back into the office. So that's like, people within the company potentially dating, or evaluating people based on your personal relationships with them
yeah,
versus valuing them based on their work product. And that's the type of like very devastating, I think, culture, right?
yeah,
Because those are the cultures, especially because if you are a diverse person and you're not a part of the dominant culture, you also are speaking a different language. And I think that's one of the things that is most complex about being a diverse person, is that a lot of times you're like multilingual. Like I always say, like, because I'm a trans, non-binary, black, lesbian from the South, I can speak at least six languages, right?
yeah,
Of society and how the world works. Whereas if someone who's a part of that dominant culture, they really only have potentially that one or two languages, right? And
yeah,
because they're not thinking on those different languages, those different levels in those different languages, it means that we're not going to connect. They're not like, so when I'm saying something that could be very much construed as just like a normal basic thing, all of a sudden it becomes a, oh, you said this thing that is completely different than what your actual intention is. And so that's the kind of the cultural divide. And that's where leadership comes up, right? Because if leadership has that ability to kind of in those different languages and kind of like see the bigger picture, then they can kind of start creating that lens for other people inside the company. So then it becomes a safer space, I think, overall for everyone.
yeah, definitely. And and companies recognizing intersectionality is so important as well, isn't it? Because we know that obviously a lot of companies have their employee resource groups, their ERGs or a similar name, and there may be one, for LGBT plus, there may be one for accessibility and so on. But for people, as you've said, if you're Black, you're non-binary, and you have different characteristics, and you have all these different languages. How can companies really make sure that individuals with that intersectionality are recognized and included, rather than all those different ERGs potentially working a bit in silo?
Yeah, so this is actually a huge challenge. So every company I've ever been at, it's a huge challenge. So for instance, when I'm in the Black group, I'll bring up LGBTQ issues, especially because there's a lot of
Yeah,
there's a certain amount of like homophobia and transphobia that still exists within the Black society. Also within the LGBTQ group, there's like a certain amount of racism that exists,
right.
in the larger group against Black people. And then within the LBQG, there's a little bit of transphobia that exists against trans folks, right? So it is like this constant process of education. And so in those situations, I think again, it's really fascinating because I think personally I find it an opportunity to try to gain allies. I'm like, okay, well at least they speak a
Yeah.
few more languages than a typical person. So then like maybe if I can start having that conversation with the folks in that group about, oh, by the way, when you said this, you actually were kind of excluding me, right? Like, because
Yeah.
you weren't thinking about my particular identity and trying to make them smarter about that. And the fact that, we have to, like, that's the thing about, I think, how society has a tendency to kind of group us anyway. Like, for instance, I hate the fact that it's LGBTQ plus because the plus kind of denotes there's like this like umbrella of
Yeah.
folks who are just like they're not quite at the level
Yeah. To
that
have
they
a
have like
letter.
the letter,
Yeah.
but they're somewhere below that. But the reality is that the whole LGBTQ term, period, probably just isn't really great because you have trans folks who are, expressing a different gender identity or are gender diverse. And then
Yeah.
you have the L, the B, and the G, and the Q, which is just sexuality, right? And
Yeah.
so that's another one of those things that's kind of interesting. And so it's also it's again it's about that education piece of explaining. So for instance, I often don't join the pride group at my companies because I'm just like, well, I mean, I'm really good there. Like, I really want to talk more about the trans thing. So, like, how can we
Yeah.
talk? Like, which group is a trans group? And then how can that trans group then partner with some of the other groups to kind of, again,
Yeah.
continually educate? And then I think from a company perspective, that's when it comes to, like, if you are at a company that is sophisticated enough to have DEI professionals, then you need to have DEI professionals who really are thinking on that level, right? Because there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done to educate the entire company and then educate different individuals about the different about intersectionality and how it works because and it has to be reinforced every conversation, right? So for instance, one of my colleagues at another company, that's what she does. Like every single time they have a DEI meeting, every time they have a space that she can talk about it, she reinforces the same idea over and over and over again. And I bet if you happen to go talk to anyone at her company and you were like, oh, like, do you know what intersectionality is? They would be like, yes, I do.
Yeah.
Because I get told it before every single meeting.
Yeah. I have seen a few more companies having separate trans groups as well as their LGBTQ plus group, which I think is, as you say, is important because it's sometimes the trans element that feels it's not as focused on as much, or it's at the end of the LGBT, and it's not quite the same as you were saying. But then there's also if you're in a company and you don't have out trans individuals working there, but you wanted to be prepared for if someone was to transition, and you want to ensure that you're supporting those individuals, but you don't know who they are. What are some of the things that you think companies could put in place to kind of be set up so that somebody may feel comfortable, saying that they are transitioning on the job and things like that?
Yeah. And also I guess we should just kind of call out that statistically, if you have a company that's like, let's say over 1,000 or 1,500 people, you probably have at least one trans person who you work
Yeah,
with, and you may not know it.
may not know. Yeah,
So yeah, and so the thing is there's a lot of really great organizations out there. So basically, if you look at U.S. sources, right? So I know this is
yeah.
probably
We've
like
got both tuning in.
yeah,
Yeah,
I was like, but there's like the Transgender Law Center. Even like P Flag has a lot of like trans, I have a trans kid, like what should I do type of resources. So there's actually a lot of really great websites you can go to that just talk about some of the things that you should think about. And the number one thing I would say, and so one of the reasons that trans resource groups are actually super important, is especially around medical issues, so like benefits and things like that. So, for instance, I'm on the board of an organization called Howard Brown Health, which is one of the largest LGBTQ health centers in the United States. And so, what's really great about being on the board is that we got to be one of like the first organizations that had a whole bunch of trans folks who worked for us, and we had to work with insurance companies to figure out, like it seems like you don't cover these basic things that are trans care. And so that's a huge area where companies can really get ahead of the curve and start thinking about what types of procedures or what types of care, for instance, testosterone or just any like, hormone replacement therapy, electrolysis, top or bottom surgeries, and making sure that their policies cover that. And one of the reasons for that is that also, like when you do have that person who's inside of your organization, it's a huge retention factor, right? So like if you don't have those services, there's a chance that that person who again you may not even know is trans may leave your company
yeah,
because they don't have services that are covered. And I always, the product manager in me, I kind of think of companies as products, right?
yeah,
And so you don't want anyone who helps make the product work to leave over
Yeah.
something that basic.
Yeah, because it'd be a shame to lose, a really talented individual in whatever skill they have, just because they're transitioning. Ideally you would be able to retain that person and have the support there, and as they move through it, and obviously retain them, and it's financially better for everyone as well, isn't it? So,
Yeah. Oh, and actually, one more thing. So another thing that I feel like is not often thought about is you probably want to go ahead and create policies around what does it look like to change the name in the system. So, for instance, there's a lot of bad technology out there. Again, as a product manager, this is the
yeah.
things I get to see where it's very difficult to change your name in systems, and so that
Okay.
can be very harmful to individuals. So, for instance, like Google Suite is probably a little bit better than some other systems that they actually change from your dead name to your chosen name much more easily.
Yeah.
But even like very large HR management systems, some of those actually don't have any resources that allow a company to allow for a person to change their name easily. And so that might even be a factor in terms of how you decide which software to buy. But it also is a great way for companies to be great advocates and allies, right? Because if you're asking those questions of those companies,
Yeah.
there's a higher likelihood that those companies might choose to change how their systems work in order to support, the potential business. And so that's a really great way to kind of to actively be an ally without even really,
Yeah.
having an employee yet.
Yeah, no, it's really good advice. And it's also so important to, I imagine, look at how you recruit, and even language in your recruitment policies and your recruitment ads, I guess, so that if you are trans or non-binary and looking at that company, that you instantly can see that that company has, put some effort into being inclusive from that very moment, which may be the decider on whether you apply or not.
Oh, very much so. And it's actually really interesting because it even like, so for instance, one of the things that I know a few years ago, it was like people started looking at job requirements, and so many times the job language was like he will do this, right?
Yeah.
And then so people started doing she, just to
Yeah.
be nice. But also like gender neutral works all the time, right? Like so you can say they them there. And
Yeah.
I definitely do agree that when you talk about benefits, so obviously you want to say like, full benefits or things like that. But, it's just as important to say like also, transitional care, and then also just generally, maternity leave and things like that. So there's
Yeah.
there's like, that's the other thing that's I think that has to kind of demystify. As a trans person, I care just as much about what the maternity leave is going to look like or
Yeah.
adoption assistance as, any other individual who you
Parental
might hire,
policies.
that you
Yeah.
might hire. So it's also just like this very from a very logical standpoint. It's like being louder about how you're going to support a full human, right?
Yeah.
However that human comes to you, I think it's just a good policy for companies to follow.
Yeah, definitely. And have you been kind of brought into any conversations with, the people that do write the policies and put the ads out? So people in HR or the DEI teams, have you kind of, as a member of those network groups and as an ally, been kind of brought into those conversations for your input, or has it been dealt with kind of just by those leaders?
I'm very fortunate because, especially for my last few companies I've worked at, like they're very inclusive organizations. And so I've often been a part of groups. Well, often what happens is the companies will say, we're thinking about this thing. We would love to get people's opinions, right? So, like, all like my last 3 or 4 companies, yeah, have all done that. So it's like super, super great.
Yeah.
However, I will say that companies before that, I didn't necessarily have that experience. And so it was important for me where I kind of stood up and said, by the way, I'm non-binary. And it looks like our systems don't do this thing. So that's why I say that proactive approach is really great, right?
Yeah.
Because, I've obviously, felt very comfortable in my most recent companies and I've done my best work.
Yeah.
And so like that's also that interesting correlation. Like you get probably way more value out of it because, especially when I'm getting asked to, attend a meeting where we're talking about healthcare benefits, or if something comes up where like something isn't covered, being able to reach out to my employee benefits team, and then we have an entire conversation, and then knowing that they'll actually advocate and make sure that gets covered in the future, or they'll even just go to bat for you in that moment to make sure that you get the kind of care that you need. And actually, and one thing that I guess I want to like point out about how important this is that you know in the United States. So I mentioned that I'm originally from like the Mississippi or Tennessee area. So both of those states actually have policies or are enacting policies that would mean that doctors could actually prohibit my care, right? So there's also like from the United States federal guidelines,
Yeah.
there's also an agenda that was put down by the president that would do the same thing, but individually the states have done the same thing.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons why it's so important, I think, again, for companies to kind of make this a point with insurers is because that's another avenue to kind of get around those laws and make sure that, individuals are actually getting reasonable care. And so one of the most damning things I heard from someone, I was talking, the coworker was just talking, and she talked about the fact that, she's actually thinking about moving states because her state's also a state that's kind of weird in that way. And with the current federal issues, she's a little worried. But she's like, at this point, she's worried about telling a doctor if she were to go there. So she passes fully as a cisgender woman. And she said, I'm afraid to tell them I'm transgender, and that means that I will not be able to get the right care because I think that they wouldn't treat me. And I was just like, what does
Okay.
that mean that people like so an individual could have a health problem who's trans and they would be too afraid to go to the doctor and admit that so that the doctor can do a full examination to make sure
Yeah.
that they're going to be okay. And
That's
so
not good.
what's really great about that though is then when one of the team members who was in part of benefits was, hearing that was just like, okay, give me information. Like, let me figure out, like, we want to figure out how we can be helpful here. And these examples are really going to help us think about how we can like work from our place, our place of power. And that's the other thing about it. Corporations, especially in the United States, there's a huge place of power, right? Because
Yeah.
you employ so many people, you pay so many taxes. And so there's a little bit of that ability to kind of talk to people in Congress or talk to your local legislators to kind of ensure, say, we can't be competitive. We can't work here if we can't have employees who can feel safe and comfortable in their position.
Yeah, definitely. And how does it work with, so if you were in a customer facing team, so if you are responsible for DEI in your organization, people tuning in, and you have customer facing teams, how can you make sure that if there was anyone who was to transition while working for you, that they would be supported in that interaction with, changing their name with the customer, and do they would they tell them themselves? Would it be the manager that actually, tells the customer that? And are there policies around that? Or how can you kind of, if you were in those teams, how would you best support?
Yeah, so I think that has to be a bespoke experience. So I always tell folks like I'm kind of a weird case of like transitioning much later in my career. So for me it was much easier because I was in a position where I was very confident. I had enough authority in
Yeah,
my work product that I could just kind of walk into places and say, I'm trans, go tell people, make sure they treat me nice, right?
yeah,
Because like that's my personality.
yeah,
However, not everyone has my personality. So I would say that if I were the manager, right, I would have that person come in and it's like, okay, great. So, I'm so happy. I'm your number one cheerleader. You're transitioning. You're becoming the person that you always believed you could be. I'm so excited for you. I want to figure out how to make this a safe,
yeah.
wonderful experience for you. How do
Internally
you
and
want to handle
externally.
Exactly. And it's like, how do you want us to go about making sure customers respect, your chosen name and your pronouns? And so that person might come up with, oh, like I feel like I want to have that conversation, especially let's say if it's like an account management type role where it's like
Yeah,
a very like
very
high
close.
touch one-on-one, like the chances are hopefully they have enough trust that they can have that conversation.
Yeah,
Obviously, and then you can have that, and you could say, okay, great. Like if you want to have that one-on-one conversation, that's great. Let me know how it goes. If there's any issues, I'm here for you. On the flip side of it, let's say if they're a person who's saying, I actually don't really feel that great about doing that, like I feel like I would feel a little uncomfortable, then I would say that there's a few different options. Like, for instance, for me personally, I prefer to have like I tell my managers if they could like reach out to all the people that I'm going to come in high contact with. Right. So there's always like levels, right? So it's like the first, like, let's say the first two levels of people I'm going to contact that with frequently, and maybe to send them a message explaining like, this is B, this is their pronouns, this is how you use their pronouns in a
yeah,
sentence, and this is a little bit of information about what this means,
yeah,
right? Like especially if it's a company that does not necessarily have experience with this, and then that way that might be one avenue as well. So again, I think you really have to talk to the employee because
yeah,
I also think that everyone's coming out experience is different, right? So for instance, they might be ready to tell you that they're trans, but it might take them a year to be ready to tell their, people they're working with.
yeah.
that
of
they're
course.
trans, right? So that there's a big difference there.
Yeah. And hopefully, and this comes back to it being an inclusive culture generally, is that, ideally you would feel comfortable that you could tell your manager even before you are ready to tell those wider contacts and customers and all of that, so that you've got their support, of your very close co-worker while you're going through that process as well.
Yeah. And
Yeah, I
this
do.
actually comes to another good point. And you should actually, like, so if you are a manager of people, you should probably find out what your local laws or rules are around trans, like what types of protections there are,
Yeah.
because that might also heavily influence whether someone would actually come to you and tell you or not. So, for
Yeah.
instance, again, my story about being from Mississippi or Tennessee, if I were in Mississippi or Tennessee, I would not come out as trans at my job.
Right.
Like,
Okay.
and so, but I live in California right now. So in
Yeah.
California, I'm like, yes, I'm trans, I got tattoos, like, I could be as loud as I want about all the
Yeah.
different things. And so that's something to also keep in mind, is that because the other thing is hopefully if you're like a wonderful manager, which I'm assuming most people in this audience are,
Yeah.
um, you'll notice changes even if someone doesn't say something,
Yeah.
right? It might be that really good click for you saying, okay, why hasn't that person come to me? And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
because we live in a place where maybe this wouldn't work out so well.
Right. Would you ever go back down south? Now that obviously you've had this experience over here, where it's
Yeah.
more kind of open.
Actually, my uncle lived in Chicago. So I lived in Chicago for 12 years before moving to California. And my uncle moved from, like, we were both in Chicago at the same time. And he moved back down to Memphis. And he just asked me, he's like, Memphis is so cool now. Like, would you come? And I was like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's just, it's one of those things, like, there's nothing that can replace the comfort of walking
Yeah.
down the street, walking in an office, walking into a doctor's office, and knowing that most often they're going to see you as just a regular human
Yeah.
and treat you as their equal. So going
Yeah.
back to that, like, what does inclusion look like? It's about being treated equally, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's the big difference for me.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I think it's a shame that there's obviously there are still those areas in the US. Obviously, is very different again from the UK. Everyone is on that journey, but yeah, it's a shame that a company in that area of the country may not you know benefit from your talents and skills because of. But I guess, as you say, it does come down to the area laws as well as what the company themselves does. So as much as a company can proactively do, I guess, themselves and take that ownership on themselves to protect their employees, the better.
Yeah, it's exactly. And it's actually really interesting in this COVID world because a lot of people are going home, right?
Yeah.
But we talk about it still, like, 'cause it's not just me, like, for instance, because it's not just being trans, it's also being a lesbian, right? Like, like
Yeah.
those are two things that
Two
don't go that
things.
well
Yeah.
for the United States. But even for folks who are heterosexual, it's just like, okay, if I do go back to some of those places, you're not going to be there, B, right? So, like, it also becomes like that, like, what's the value add, right? The rich
Yeah.
of your life, because I do miss Southern food, right?
Yeah.
I really miss the
I
Southern
love
food
Southern food.
so much, right? But it's just like, like, culturally, like, you just have to feel like it's like when I walk into spaces, like, how do we feel, right? And it's like so funny because so we were talking about my shirt, and so I have like all these different shirts that
Yeah.
I've been rotating through because it's like, why not wear funny
Yeah.
shirts during a
Definitely.
quarantine? But the other shirt I was gonna wear was love first, right? Because
Ah,
that's how I feel. It's like if you
yeah.
lead with love, usually really good things happen to you.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a good rule to live by, I would say. If talking more generally about creating an inclusive culture, if a company could do, say, three things that you would say that would give them an A plus in your eyes, or if you were ever looking to, progress your career elsewhere, what would you look for in an organization in this industry that would make you think, yes, I would be, absolutely able to bring my full self and be 100% included there, as you have been at Netflix and some of your previous companies?
Yeah. So every company that I felt has a good handle on these types of topics, it starts off with like a very clear values and mission, right? They know why they're doing their business, and then they've constructed values that allow them to hit that mission. And the values are usually really simple things. For Apple, it's like customers first, right? Like, make
Yeah.
things easy, simple for customers, right? Which means they also try to make things easy and simple, when it comes to like just a lot of concepts around employees. That's why, Apple has a medical center and cafes on every like campus because they
Yeah.
wanted to make it really easy for you to kind of work. So that's first and foremost. Like they have to, it's kind of funny, but it's like if a company is going through an identity crisis or doesn't have an identity yet, chances are they're not ready to handle your
Yeah.
identity, right?
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two is having like a very clear policies around um, I'm trying to think of the best way. So it's like they have like their healthcare and all those other things have to be very clear, right? It has to be very simple. Like for instance, the best companies I've worked at, they actually list those things. So and then again, it goes to like the maternity leave and everything else too. But they
Yeah.
list out something very simple. In fact, every job that I've had a hard time either not accepting. So for instance, like every time I've had an offer where I was just like, man, I kind of wanted to take it. It's also a company that it was so easy to understand like all of the benefits that they kind of support to make sure that I feel like I can be successful from a work-life balance and also from like a
Yeah.
health and transition balance. And then number three is, I actually really, really pay attention to like when before I choose a company, I look up the CEO, all the C-suite people, all the senior level people, and I look at their Facebook, their Twitter, their LinkedIn, and I
Yeah.
look at what they're sharing. And if
Yeah.
they're not sharing things that are interesting, and when I say interesting is like, so for instance, um, you know, Reed Hastings, you see stuff that he shares all the time. It's always like, how can he make education better? How can he make the world better? Right? Obviously, Tim Cook, that's what he shares too. He's like, he's so excited about like figuring out how to, make more people interested in technology, making more
Yeah.
young people interested in creating apps. The companies that like are really successful, it comes through their leaders, right? Even
Yeah.
when you start looking at their directors, like when you start looking at the people who kind of represent the brand, it's
Yeah.
like all these people who are really engaged in their industry, obviously, but they're also really engaged in the world and figuring out how to make the world more successful. And so when you see that type of energy from leadership, that's going to kind of be imbued throughout the entire organization, right? And
Yeah.
if that's imbued throughout the entire organization, that means that you can hopefully, again, like, unless someone really lied, right? They're like someone's completely doing something, their social media is not them.
Yeah.
You should be able to go into that space and be very free to talk when something's wrong. Because the thing is no organization is perfect. Like no, because it's not possible. I mean, I'm a product manager. I've built so many products, and I'm like, okay, we're getting close to getting to 50% good,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm like fifty
Never
percent is great,
perfect.
right? Like you're never perfect, but so no organization is going to be perfect. But if it has leaders who have that capacity to think deeply about hard subjects, it means that when you raise your hand and say something isn't right, they're going to think deeply about that subject and how they can solve it. And that's really that's what you really have to hope for is people that you can
Yeah.
really engage with and help you create something that's better.
Yeah. No, I do always find that really useful to do that due diligence on the people that lead a company if I'm looking to apply to it, because you can tell so much by somebody's social media, whether it's their work facing one or it's their personal one. And you can, you sometimes I've gone back a couple of years, and looked at what they've
Yeah,
shared, and
yeah,
you just it's so worth doing because you do get a real idea of what that leadership team is actually really about, and you can see whether it is just that they're creating policies and following policies, or if they're fully engaged in it and making the change. So that
yeah.
actually is a good tip. We will just for the last 5 minutes or so just go to a couple of audience questions. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we have. Do you think, B, that the pandemic has had a positive or negative impact on diversity and inclusion focuses? And can you see that there'll be any long-term changes that might help towards inclusion?
So I'm going to say it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And the reason I say it's a mixed bag is that for companies that haven't done well, some of the DEI roles have been some of the roles that have been cut, right?
Yeah.
So on one hand, I think that could potentially be a bad thing
Yeah.
long term. But on the flip side of it, I've seen that companies that I think historically have been terrible at DEI because of the fact that they're having to think more strategically about how to keep their employees motivated and healthy during
Yeah.
this experience. I think that's naturally going to lead to a little bit more support, I think, overall for
Yeah.
DEI issues. So, for instance, like, even companies that don't have a good reputation for it, like Google and Facebook, some of the things that they're implementing, right, to support employees at home, and also some of the things that they're actually starting to think about, So, for instance, number one thing that so many folks who are very diverse have talked about is they don't want to stay in the Bay Area anymore, right? The
Yeah.
Bay Area is very expensive, and also it's not necessarily conducive to, if you're Black or
Yeah.
Latinx. Even from an Asian perspective, there's a lot, like, because of the epidemic, there's been a lot of harm to the Asian community. And so this is the first time companies are saying, well, sure, you can leave the area, you can go live somewhere else, which
Yeah.
means that potentially people will be going back to communities that will be a little bit more safe and
Mhm.
create a happier space for themselves, which of course leads to greater mental health. And then
Yeah.
hopefully then you can feel a little bit more comfortable being more your true self. So again, it's a mixed bag, I think.
Yeah.
And we won't really know for
We won't
probably
know
a
for a
couple of
while.
years, like
Yeah.
exactly how it's gonna wash out.
What will be quite interesting to see is whether more companies start hiring based on, obviously you don't have to be in the area or willing to
Mhm.
move to the area. So if it's a role where you can work from home either all or most of the time, you could go back home and live somewhere but still be applying for a company that's based in the Bay Area. It'll be interesting to see if companies are able to sort of fill their talent gaps and get the people they want in much easier. So
Yeah.
that would be good.
Well, and I think we're crossing our fingers because the other thing about that is if folks have more job opportunities, more
Yeah.
economic success is also number one way to create more, equity, right?
Yeah.
So that would be the ideal goal is like
Yeah.
have all those diverse folks have this equal opportunities as everyone else and be treated equally, and then you kind of have like bringing the whole ship up with that
Yeah.
one move.
Yeah, definitely. And one final one to end on before we run out of time. Um, do you think employee resource groups generally are effective when they are, so a lot of companies, one of the first things that they may do when trying to, make a difference and improve their D&I efforts would be to set up these groups. Um, what's the best way that they can be effective, do you think? Whether that's, exec sponsorship and who that is, whether that's what their goals are and if they're tied to the organization's overall goals. Is it allies? Kind of what would make them, I suppose, allow companies to really maximize the effectiveness of those rather than just being a group of people who meet up and talk about, the things that affect the same as each other?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I think a couple years ago, McKinsey did this move where they disbanded all their ERGs because they were like, we're beyond it.
Yeah.
And it didn't really work out well. So first, I
Okay.
want to say that I think that they're like, we have to say that ERGs have a space that they can be successful.
Yeah.
However, as someone who's been on a number of boards, I feel like ERGs suffer from the same thing that boards can suffer from, which is if they don't have great leadership and great structure, they can kind of flounder and
Yeah.
not really accomplish anything. In fact, I'm working with a couple of different ERGs right now to think about like how can we structure it so that it's successful for an extended period of time. So like creating like an actual charter similar to what you do with boards and things like that. So first, I think that it has to have a purpose, right? So for instance, one of the number one, an ERG can be a lot of different things, right? So it can be a space that has no desire to kind of go outside of itself, and it's just an internal space for employees to gather and talk about, their lived experiences and how that might work out, right? So, like for instance, the Black Hat group, after George Floyd, we just spent time just talking about how difficult it was to kind of see that happen
Yeah.
and heal together, right? And in that space, there's really no need for a sponsor or anything else.
Yeah.
But on the flip side of that, when the goal is to actually make change at the organization, when it's kind of an advocacy perspective, I do think that there needs to be corporate, like a sponsor of some sort. And the reason for that is that they have like, so even if you like, so if it's a one-on-one relationship, so even if I'm just an individual who wants advocacy, I probably need to find a champion somewhere,
Yeah.
right, to help ensure that advocacy happens. And so if, the ERG's focus is actually, affecting change within the company, then there needs to be a company sponsor. But I also think that there needs to be a decoupling of these things, right? So like we've always said, well, ERG has to be in the same format, blah, 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 blah. I think you probably need to do a survey of the people who would potentially belong in the ERG to figure out what they're more interested in the ERG being. And if there's like a split where people, it's like 50-50, like we want both advocacy and we also want this like healing space,
Yeah.
then create an actual structure of the ERG that can support that. Because the one thing I will say, and I think one of the reasons that companies struggle with ERGs to such an extent is because when you have like this like confluence of lots of different efforts, it becomes unclear how you can actually support such an organization.
Yeah.
Right. So you can clearly define it from the beginning what the intention of the organization is going to be, create a structure around that so that like there's champions within, that organization to kind of make sure that whatever the need is being met. Then you're going to be more successful, and then the company doesn't have to continually try to pivot to support which way the ERG is kind of focusing at a given time. So that's a long way to say, do your due diligence first, your pre-work.
Yeah.
And that's going to help you figure out what structure is going to make the most sense for your ERGs within your organization.
Yeah, and really good point about actually speaking to the people who would be interested in being part of that ERG as well, to see what their particular goal for their involvement would be as well. That's a really good point, rather than just setting one up and just saying, it's here, join it.
Exactly.
So on that note, we'll unfortunately have to wrap up as we're out of time, but thank you so much to Bea for that's some really good advice there, I think, and I think they've given some great insights there that hopefully some people on this call will be able to take from that. So thank you so much for your time and for doing this in the middle of the night for you, so really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for listening as well. In a minute, you will see a note pop up on your screen with a link to take you across to our next session, which will be starting at 1 o'clock UK time. And that's going to be with Susie Miller at Microsoft, talking about accessibility and disability inclusion in tech. So don't miss that one. Hopefully see you across there. And thank you again, Bea, and thank you to the audience. See you later on. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.